The United States is sending approximately 1,000 additional troops to the Middle East. That's in addition to the roughly 1,500 additional troops President Trump announced he was sending to the region back in late May. In a statement, Acting Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan says the deployment comes following a request from the U.S. Central Command and is, quote, for defensive purposes to address air, naval, and ground-based threats in the region. Joining the table, the co-host of Morning Joe First Look, Yasmin Vossoughian. She has new reporting for NBCNews.com on Secretary of State Mike Pompeo meeting with U.S. commanders amid the growing tensions with Iran. Also with us from Doha, Qatar, NBC News Chief Global Correspondent Bill Neely. Bill, we'll start with you. What's the latest?
Yeah, well, on top of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign on Iran, we might now have maximum resistance from Iran. I mean, resistance is built into Iran's DNA, but more than that, also maximum pressure of their own from Iran with that announcement yesterday on its ramping up its production of low-grade uranium and threatening to breach the nuclear deal limit. Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, saying this morning, we don't want to wage war, but taking a swipe at the U.S., saying those facing us are a group of politicians with little experience. And as you say, from U.S. Central Command and the Pentagon, an announcement of another 1,000 U.S. troops to the region. They'll be used for surveillance and intelligence gathering on Iran and its proxies, also used to protect U.S. troops from what the Pentagon calls a credible threat. And it'll be used not just here in the Gulf, but likely in Iraq, possibly in Syria too. So just within days, we have a military buildup. We have attacks on tankers. We have a nuclear warning from Iran. And really, the problem is no sign of a way out. No talks. Likely, Iran's supreme leader has already dismissed any talks with President Trump. And all we see is a growing confrontation. And certainly here in the Gulf, from shipping companies who are worried about more attacks on tankers. There are some of them even asking for military escorts, all the way to governments in Moscow and across Europe. There is real concern that this is leading to potentially a very dangerous confrontation.
So, Bill, as they used to say on the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon show, I don't know if they played that in England, but in the United States, I grew up with it. Rocky, Rocket J. Squirrel would say, and now for something completely different. But you're in Doha. I've got to ask a question. A couple of hours ago, they arrested one of the top officials, former top officials, for bribery connected in awarding the 2022 World Cup to Qatar. And I'm wondering what the reaction is in that country, and whether you, as a big fan, a big Leeds fan, whether you believe that there is any possibility that, as some people are talking about now, the World Cup may be moved to England in 2022.
It is certainly something completely different, and it centers on Michel Platini, the former captain and star player of the French national team, who became a big fish in European football. And yes, he has been arrested for questioning about the awarding to this tiny Gulf state of the next World Cup. I mean, it was controversial from the very minute that it was announced. You'll remember, Joe, that both Russia and Qatar were awarded the 2 World Cups at the same time. And to be absolutely honest and put it frankly, many people said this just stinks, and it stinks of money. You know, Qatar is not one of the great powers in world football. It's true they have just, won an Asian championship. Indeed, they just beat, I think it was Paraguay last night. But that doesn't give them the right to host a World Cup. The World Cup had to be moved from the summer to the winter. There have always been allegations that actually it won it simply through big bucks. So Platini is being questioned, you know, a big blow for his reputation, whether it's true or not. And yes, there are many people who are questioning whether, in fact, Qatar should hold the World Cup. But look, it has built an amazing infrastructure, it has to be said, with air-conditioned stadiums and so on. I don't think at the minute there's any sign that this World Cup will be taken away. It would be a huge blow, not just for Qatar, but for the Middle East in general and for the growth of world football. But nevertheless, something here stinks, and that's why Platini is being investigated by police right now.
Showing range. Bill Neely, thank you very much. So, thanks, Bill. So, Yasmin, back to Iran.
You don't want to talk about the World Cup because I've been studying.
Okay,
no, I have
not. She has range too.
No, it was just a total payoff. They didn't have any, they never played anyway. But yeah,
you've got reporting.
Eamon is not alongside me. If Eamon were here, he would talk about the World Cup. Yeah, I am not the World Cup talker.
Okay,
so I can talk Iran, though.
You've got reporting on Iran and also Secretary of State Mike Pompeo.
Yeah. So yesterday I got a call actually, basically saying that Pompeo was headed to CENTCOM, and then we reached out to the State Department to say what's the schedule on Pompeo, and they said they had an announcement coming up, but there was nothing public about the fact that he was going to be heading to CENTCOM. And then they said actually this was on the schedule for the last month. But I think what Bill just said was that the timing and the optics of this is very interesting, to say the least. He's going to be meeting with General Clark of SOCOM, also with General McKenzie of CENTCOM as well, to be talking about this additional troops that are going to be sending. They're going to be sending to the Middle East. As we mentioned, as Mika mentioned, in late May, 1,500 troops were approved to be sent to the Middle East. On top of that, now we're seeing 1,000 plus troops being sent to the Middle East as well. I think, as we all know at this table, the optics of this and the grand scheme of this is that 2,500 troops is a blip on the radar. It's not a lot of troops to be heading to the Middle East. But as we well know, hearing from what Iran said yesterday, they do not want confrontation from the United States. They do not want to go to war with the United States. But if they are attacked, they have said that they will respond.
So what is the purpose of sending these troops? I mean, if it's just a blip, what is the actual objective here?
I think it's the optics of it all. I mean, I think that's really what it comes down to. They want Iran to see that they're serious about all of this, right? And if, in fact, Iran is responsible for these oil tanker attacks, as the U.S. says, but Iran continues to deny, Iran wants to say, look, it's expensive. It's going to be expensive if you want to go to war with us. And look at the crude oil prices that went up significantly on Friday after those oil tanker attacks.
And what's really interesting is you have the Secretary of State down in MacDill Air Force Base, not the Secretary of Defense.
Exactly. The acting Secretary of Defense still.
Yeah, which Donald Trump is growing more skeptical of by the day. So, Caddy, there's always been a disconnect between the United States and our closest European allies, whether it had to do with Iraq before that war, but also across the decades with Iran. We've always taken a much harder line position against Iranian adventurism than a lot of our European allies. Is there skepticism from Europe regarding the president's claims?
There's been some skepticism expressed, and actually more by Japanese, and they are the owners of one of the tankers, and Shinzo Abe, of course, was in Iran when that was attacked, and he has said he'd like to see more of the evidence. There is some desire to see more evidence. The Americans say they have the ironclad evidence. They've released now today some new images, but those images don't really prove that it was the Iranians who put the mine on the ship. They seem to show it taking the mine away from the ship. And there is a credibility issue here. After 2.5 years of Donald Trump saying things that aren't always true, when the American administration now says, we have evidence that it was Iran who did these attacks, you're starting to get the reaction from allies, which is, well, show us the evidence then.
Right.
Not, okay, we accept it. And that is an erosion of credibility. On those 2,500 U.S. troops that are going, clearly this is not an assault force. This is not a land invasion force. It seems that these are more defensive and protective of American interests. The Americans are aware that if this tension ratchets up and we get into some kind of conflict by mistake, which is what I'm being told is the most likely possibility at this point, that you could have some inadvertent move that leads towards conflict, then you need to have your diplomats, your aid workers, your personnel in the region protected, and that's what these 2,500 troops are ostensibly going to do.
You know, I'd really love to hear from some cabinet members that worked in the Trump administration but left because they did not feel they could be. I'd love to hear from Mattis. I'd love to hear from anybody about the dysfunction and pointing exactly to what Katie just said, the erosion in our
trust.
credibility on the world stage, which could not be more dangerous.
It's bigger than that. I mean, read David Sanger's article in the New York Times. It's not just the erosion of credibility, it's the lack of cohesion. I mean, we have a North Korea
Everything.
policy,
There's no policy
that is completely at odds with our Iranian policy with respect to nuclear weapons programs. And if I'm the Iranians, I look at how Trump has completely catered to Kim Jong-un, and I say, well,
Yeah.
if we get a nuclear weapon, maybe we can get preferential treatment like they've gotten. So there's no cohesion.
Well, and the
here.
Iranians are also
Joe-
saying, look, we sat with the Americans for years and years, and we came up with the JCPOA, this agreement that then the Trump administration backed out of. So how are we supposed to trust them now?
Katie.
And one other thing, the lack of a U.S. Secretary of Defense is at the moment worrying allies. And I've spoken to European diplomats who have said that they felt that General Mattis, who was no softie when it came to Iran, actually acted as a kind of bulwark against against Bolton on the issue of military force used against Iran. And because there is only an acting there when it comes to sitting in the Situation Room, that doesn't have the same weight as the Pentagon being able to say to the NSA, okay, let's push back against this and look at alternative scenarios.
So, you know, Gene, we've been hearing for years people saying that because of Donald Trump's, let's just say his untruths, his deliberate untruths, as the Soviets used to say, that at some point that would impact the United States, because if they couldn't trust Donald Trump in the small things, they wouldn't trust Donald Trump in the larger things. It reminds me of what David Ignatius said while we were having a standoff with the Soviet Union, and a U.S. ambassador went to show de Gaulle satellite imagery and started to hand it to de Gaulle, and he said, I don't need to see your pictures. I believe you. Put them back in your briefcase. The French are with you. Well, we're a long way from that point now, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's ancient history now at this point, and nobody's going to believe this administration without seeing ironclad evidence. But, you know, looking at the big picture, somebody tell me how this ends, right? The administration has had this policy basically from day one of maximum pressure on Iran, of canceling the nuclear agreement, punishing sanctions that have crippled the Iranian economy. And so now you see the Iranians rather predictably striking back. Let's assume they are responsible for these attacks. They have threatened to resume the production of nuclear materials beyond what the agreement allows, which is alarming Europeans who are parties to the deal and others, is alarming everybody. So if the idea was to squeeze the Iranians until they hurt and they lash out, then that's that's been successful. But now what? What is the diplomatic off-ramp? Because a policy that's just based on the expectation of capitulation, of total and complete capitulation, does not seem to me likely to work with Iran. It hasn't ever worked, and I don't think it's going to work now. And so where do you end up if you don't end up in some sort of conflict, either accidental or deliberate? Right. I'm trying to figure out how this ends.
So, Bob Costa, where does this end? I mean, if you follow Donald Trump and you follow his campaign rhetoric and you follow what he's done since he's been president of the United States, where does this end? Doesn't this end with the United States backing down?
If you follow the president's foreign policy, you can find a common thread when it comes to oil. Look at Venezuela, one of the biggest oil reserves in the world. The administration got aggressive down there, did not intervene militarily, but was certainly heavily involved in the standoff in Venezuela. Now a shipping lane for the oil in the Middle East and the Gulf of Oman. A lot of pressure from the business community to stabilize global oil markets, to have some kind of U.S. presence to warn off people like the revolutionaries in Venezuela or the Iranians. But this is a real test for President Trump, because as much as his advisors tell reporters he has these non-interventionist instincts, he has real pressure right now from the business community to take action, and he has pressure from hawks inside of his administration to take military action. What will he do? He sits in the chair. He doesn't have a coherent foreign policy on every front beyond this vague non-interventionism, but now he has a test, and it's up to the president to decide.
All right, Yasmin Vasugian, thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow morning on Morning Joe. First look at 5 a.m. Eastern. Do a great job. Thank you. Coming up, Donald Trump promised to hire the best people. But 2 years into his presidency, the revolving door is still turning. Up next, an in-depth examination of the entire administration and the West Wing staffers who have tried to impose order on a chaotic White House. Morning Joe will be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.